The question I'm responding to here was sent from Reagan. Reagan's question arises from Module 29, What is Ethnicity? Reagan asks, why does the United States Census, as well as forms distributed in the public schools, contain 5 categories of race and only one option categorized as ethnicity? Now, this question is partly addressed in the 3rd edition of the textbook, in that Chapter 6 part beginning on page 152 under the blue subheading, Ethnicity, Race, and the Censuses. The discussion is spread across pages 152, 154, 155, and 156. While the reading describes the bureaucratic underpinning of the census categorization of race and ethnicity, it doesn't really elaborate on the historical context for the categorization. So here we are. The classification of individuals by the United States Census into categories called races is about as old as the United States itself, and it gets into the very purpose of the census. Now, the census exists because the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 2, required that, beginning in 1790, the federal government would produce an inventory of the country's inhabitants, the entire population of each congressional district. The reason for that was because the number of seats held by each state in the House of Representatives needed to be reapportioned according to population size. Now, of course, this was necessary because the founders realized that the population would grow by natural increase and/or migration. Note that the Constitution did not require for a head count of only those people who could vote, which at the time was essentially limited to white free men who owned some land. And the Constitution specifically remarked that any indigenous peoples within the different states, referred to as Indians not taxed, were not to be included in a state's population count. This meant that all non-Indian people, including enslaved non-Indians, would count as part of the state's population. Now, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, for obvious reasons, the northern states, which had abolished slavery, argued that slaves should definitely not be counted as part of the state's population. And conversely, southern states argued that slaves should be counted as part of the state's population. And eventually, this was settled by James Madison, a slaveholding Virginian, who proposed the 3/5 compromise, which counted each slave as 3/5 of one free person. And this was a pretty significant step toward eventually obtaining unanimous ratification of the Constitution by all the states. Now, since each slave counted as 60% of one free person, thus began the job of the census in classifying inhabitants by race, at least initially, between enslaved blacks in the South and everyone else. Over the years, other races were added, including American Indians, who were granted U.S. citizenship universally in 1924. And until then, American Indians were considered citizens of their own nations and not also of the United States. By the 1920s, many American Indians had in fact become citizens after receiving allotments of land. The 1924 law simply picked up those people who had remained otherwise. As is discussed in the text reading, at present the census recognizes 5 racial categories, and these were standardized by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB. And the OMB creates standards for federal agencies like the Bureau of the Census. And in 1977, the OMB created a new rule, administrative rule, known as Directive 15. This is discussed in your text. Directive 15 initially established 4 racial categories, and a 5th was added in 1997. Those categories are, number 1, white American, number 2, black or African American, number 3, Native American or Alaska Native, number 4, Asian American, and number 5, added in 1997, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. And the largest racial minority in the United States is black or African American today. It should also be recognized that in recent decades, the census has taken pains to allow people to self-identify as belonging to 2 or more races. Now, while the term race is quite old, the term ethnic or ethnicity is actually pretty new. Although race has more than one meaning, as in many types of sporting events, a cursory comparison of its use with that of ethnicity in published books over the last few centuries reveals that ethnicity has only come into frequent use since the mid-1900s. Ethnicity is contemporaneous with the rise of the academic social sciences, such as anthropology and sociology and psychology, political science, and, of course, human geography. During the civil rights era of the 1960s and 1970s, the U.S. Census began collecting a larger and larger amount of sociocultural data on the United States population. And the old racial classification was just not as effective at capturing the growing degree of cultural diversity in the country, and it should be noted, it was during the 1960s that the old American tradition of expecting immigrants to assimilate began to come into question. People immigrating from places as far-flung as Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, the Philippines, Spain, all of whom shared a legacy of Spanish cultural influence as well as the Spanish language, didn't share similar racial characteristics, and this presented a classification conundrum to the Census Bureau. The solution was the creation of a separate transracial ethnic classification that they called Hispanic, and within the last 30 years, Hispanic Latino. In 1977, Directive 15 identified only one ethnic group, Hispanic or Latino, and this has not changed. So officially, according to the U.S. Census, there are only 2 ethnicities. That would be Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino. And this kind of begs the question, what is Hispanic or Latino? Wikipedia says, Hispanic or Latino is an ethnic derivation originating in the Iberian countries and their overseas empires. Currently, Hispanic or Latino is the largest ethnic minority in the United States, and it traverses every race, meaning that somebody who is a Filipino or a Filipino ancestry may be racially Asian and Hispanic. Somebody of Puerto Rican ancestry may be African American and Hispanic. Someone of Mayan ancestry may be Native American and Hispanic. And someone of Argentinian ancestry may be white American and Hispanic. And this is not to say that it's not also possible to be Jewish, which is also an ethnicity, and African American. But the census at this particular moment doesn't collect such information. For example, I'm classified by the census as white and non-Hispanic. The census isn't very interested in the fact that I may be of Norman, French, German, Scotch-Irish, or Danish heritage. However, there is a third heritage-related classification in the census called Ancestry, which is a voluntary and not very important self-identification category containing a myriad of possible options, including American. Which brings me to my final point. The U.S. Census collects an increasingly complex body of population data every 10 years, and anyone who has ever attempted to collect population data for more than one census decade understands this, and it can be absolutely maddening. It's not inaccurate to say that there can be serious issues with using certain types of census data across several decades because the census changes or adds classification systems so frequently. So, if you've sat through all of this patiently, I really appreciate it, and thank you for listening to the Race, Ethnicity, Ancestry, Census Data video.